All right, I guess we're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to, I guess, the 4th annual Iowa State Wildness Symposium. Thank you for braving the cold and windy morning. We're going to start out with a panel on what wildlife can tell us about our changing environment. But first, I need to thank our sponsors yet again. And it's a bit of a list, so bear with me, but they're all important. The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Writer's Block, Committee on Lectures, which is funded by GSB, the English Club, the Center for Excellence in the Arts and Humanities, Departments of Philosophy and Religious Studies, the LAS Miller Lecture Fund, the Bioethics Program, Department of English, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, the Henry A. Wallace Endowed Chair for Sustainable Agriculture, the Department of Geological and Atmospheric Sciences, the Greenlee School of Journalism, the Department of Natural Resource Ecology Management, Departments of Landscape, Architecture, and Community and Regional Planning, the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology, and the Departments of Environmental Science and Environmental Studies. So all of those who have helped fund this, thank you very much. A little bit of business before we begin. Directly after this in the M Shop at 10:45, there's going to be another program called Farmscape, documenting the changing rural environment, student readers theater production. And again, this is in the M Shop, which is downstairs on the ground floor over on the west side of the building. After this, there's going to be a field trip at 1 o'clock. And although I know it's very cold, I highly recommend this. Jim Peace is going to be giving a guided tour of sorts through Reactor Woods. So if you're going to go, I also suggest that you dress warmly. What we're going to do is this: at a little bit before 1 o'clock, I'm going to bring a van around to the west entrance of the Student Union, where the M Shop is. There's a little bit of a turnaround in front of the pond or the lake, and we'll load up and go from there. So let's see if I've forgotten anything here. I think that's all of our business. Well, on Sunday, while I was listening to Brenda Peterson's talk about her friend on the beach and their discussion of the rapture and the seals, I began to think that perhaps he might have it backwards. It seemed to me that God wasn't taking the humans, but he seemed to be taking the animals, and that, in fact, we were the ones being left behind. Animals are often much more sensitive to the changes in our environment than we are. And it's been well documented that before large catastrophes, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, that animals sense this long before humans are aware of what's impending. It makes sense to consider animals or wildlife in terms of the present changes in our environment. So what this panel is going to do, we've got 5 esteemed scientists here, and they are each a specialist in one or more fields that have to do with wildlife. Each one of them is going to present a little bit about how their studies apply to this topic. And then afterwards, we're going to open it up for questions. And I hope that we can have a genuine discussion after this is all over. So we are going to go in the order of the program. So we're going to start with Diane Dubinsky here on the far right in the front row. Diane is from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology at Iowa State, and is well known for her work in the fields of conservation biology, landscape ecology, and restoration ecology. She's focused much of her recent studies on the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And then, following Diane, we have Brent Danielson from the same department, and his studies revolve around population and community ecology. And his research subjects range from mice to voles to all kinds of other critters, including snails. Fred Jansen, another veteran of the EE&O department, I will call it now, at Iowa State, studies reptile biology with a particular focus on turtles and other Mississippi River reptiles. Lisa Schulte, a member of the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management, is involved in research about ecosystem patterning and dynamics. She studies the changes in the ecosystems of the lake states and the forest agro-ecosystems in Iowa. And then finally, we have Julie Blanchong, who is another member of ISU's Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management. She is a wildlife ecologist involved in research about the causes and consequences of disease in wildlife populations, with a specific focus on the character of relationships between host ecology and the transmission and distribution of disease, identifying ecological and environmental factors associated with disease outbreaks, and evaluating the impacts of disease to wildlife populations. So thank you for coming once again, and we'll start out with Diane. Thank you, Diane.
Thanks, David, and thanks to everybody for coming this morning on a cold day to talk about climate change. So remember, it's change, and there's going to be more variation. Keep that in the back of your mind. Let me see if I can pull up my talk. So, yesterday and the previous couple of days, we've been hearing mostly from people who are English types who write beautiful combinations of words, and they create these artful combinations of prose. And now we're going to switch to a pile of scientists here, and we select against artful writing, I think, sometimes. So we select for people who have high significant p-values, and for people who have interesting graphs. So I hope that you will bear with us as we try to tell our story in our own way, and perhaps we can think about some partnering of different kinds of people to tell the story about climate change. So I made my title a little different. I said Animals and Plants as Oracles of a Changing Climate, because you can't talk about animals without talking about plants. So, and some of these organisms are some of the species I'm going to tell you a little bit about. Each one of them has a story related to climate change. Some of them are at the bottom from my research out in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and these are some of the organisms I'm seeing that are responding to short-term variations in environmental conditions. And then at the top are some of the more classic ones that you might have read about in the newspaper. So just to give you an idea where we're going, and I'm going to make this a little shorter than I thought since we had some technical difficulties at the beginning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how climate is changing, what we know, and from an abiotic perspective. What do we know about carbon dioxide, just to give you a little setting before we talk about all the wildlife stories. And then what are the environmental responses, both abiotic as well as biotic, so non-living things that we see responding as well as living things. And then, I don't know if we'll get to the quantifying, but my research focuses on how do we actually measure the organismal response to changing patterns of precipitation and temperature. So I don't know if you folks have heard of the hockey stick graphs, but these are the classic things that, when you go to a meeting about climate change, they all talk about the hockey sticks. But the bottom line is, think about cold weather. It's a good time to think about hockey sticks. The bottom of the graph is pretty flat, and then it goes straight up. And these are graphs of greenhouse gases and how they're changing over time. So you don't need to worry about all the details, but the bottom line is that each of these three graphs is talking about a greenhouse gas, and the bottom axis is time. And so for a long period of time, things like carbon dioxide, methane, or nitrous oxide did not change very much for thousands of years. And then all of a sudden things are going up pretty significantly. So what does that mean? What does that mean for wildlife and plants? Well, just to put it in perspective, here's some interesting images of people are doing lots of models of how the world might be changing. So we have documented that temperatures have increased at least about 0.5 degrees centigrade in the past 100 years. And the predictions tell us that we expect the temperatures to raise between 1.4 and 5.8 degrees in the next 100 years. And you might say on a day like today, I wouldn't mind if it went up a little bit, right? Especially those of you who are going for the walk in Reactor Woods. I wouldn't mind if it went up 5.8 degrees today. But to put that in context, the difference in temperature between the last ice age and the present is about 4 degrees centigrade. So a few degrees doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're talking about the entire globe and an average for the entire globe, it makes a big difference. And we can talk about how different places are going to change and how we're going to see different variations. And you don't need to read all the details, but the black lines are what we're seeing. And the interesting thing is the red lines have to do with when we incorporate the effects of anthropogenic change. So humans are, when you put a model together about climate change and you incorporate the effects of humans, the graphs fit better. And basically all of these places are changing and they're increasing. Okay. IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Okay, so when we think about environmental responses, we can talk about, like I said, abiotic responses and biotic. I won't go into a lot of detail about paleoclimate changes, but I'll just give you a brief summary of that, and then talk about some of the recent sets of data that tell us that things really are changing. So abiotic responses. Glacier National Park is a place where lots of people go to take vacations. I worked out there as a graduate student, so I'm pretty fond of the place. And the Grinnell Glacier, named after Grinnell, the researcher, is shown here in 1911 and then 2000. And you might say, well, okay, one glacier is getting a little bit smaller, but the point is there's a whole book out of re-photography of glaciers. And there are lots and lots of glaciers that are getting smaller and smaller. So we can quantify that glaciers in Glacier National Park are going away, and they suspect that in the near future there might not be any glaciers. There will be ice fields probably, but glaciers are different from ice fields. In terms of other abiotic responses, I don't know how many people have heard about this ocean conveyor belt. I hadn't even heard about it a few years ago. But the point is that because of differences across the globe in salinity and temperatures of water, we have this water moving around the globe, and it modifies the temperature. And scientists have been interested in whether this conveyor belt is actually slowing down or not. And they've thought for a while that it was, but then the recent data are showing that, no, it's not. But if such a thing would change because of a difference in temperature, if the gradient goes away between the poles, that could have really significant implications because the warm water that's moving around is buffering some of these places. And it's also modifying how the organisms move as well. This is kind of one of those nerdy science graphs, but I thought I'd show you anyway. So here's a picture from a recent paper talking about these tipping elements. And the whole idea is that, at some point you can change things, you can change the world a little bit, you can melt some permafrost, you can melt some ice caps, but at some point there's going to be a change where you can't go back to where you were before. And so this graph shows, for example, if you start down here, it would be hard for this ball to get over here, right? There's a barrier. It would have to go up. You can just think about how balls would fall and roll. And it would be hard for this ball to get over here. But the symbols of this diagram are showing that over time we're modifying the landscape such that we're taking away some of these barriers, and the ball could actually end up on the left-hand side. And that would be a point where things change to the point that they can't go back quite as easily. So that's one of the ideas, is thinking about thresholds and tipping points. So what are some variables that we think about when we think about these tipping points? There would be things like water temperature. So if you're a fish and you have to have a certain amount of dissolved oxygen in the water to live, temperature affects that. So it might not be quite as good. So water temperatures, dissolved oxygen, the amount of flow in a stream. People in the West are extremely worried about the amount of water, and they've been in a long-term drought in the Rocky Mountains. So the amount of water in a stream is a pretty significant thing for a lot of organisms. Salinity, if you're living out west and you're trying to irrigate and the salinity is going up, that's another issue. Lake turnover that brings the nutrients around and allows all the organisms to basically survive going through winter and then recycle those nutrients. The timing of lake turnover is changing, so that affects the organisms. Sea level, obviously, I think Brent's going to talk about that some more. Ocean acidity is a really interesting one. We don't think that ocean acidity is changing yet, but it's something to be concerned about, because if you were a shell-building organism and the ocean becomes more acidic, think about what that would do. It would not be a good situation. So over time, people have looked at the environment and said, okay, we know that things change. We know that this graph up on the top, just basically you can think about it as different lines or different species, and they increase and decrease over time. Time is going up and down. So we know that certain kinds of trees used to live in certain places, and the composition of species of plants has changed over time. And we know this from things like tree rings, pollen and plankton at the bottom of lakes, ocean sediment cores. We can document what species used to be there, and we know that things change. You can calculate these retreats and advances. So it's normal that things change. The question is, what's the rate of change, and is this rate of change a little faster than in previous time? So what are some of the data that people have been collecting recently when you think about biotic things, so organisms? And there's a new group called the National Phenology Network. I have to say that fast, National Phenology Network, based in Arizona. And what they're doing is they're doing something that some of you might be interested in, which is taking people's journals and diaries and summarizing information about when the first lilacs were blooming. And so that's their little icon, is the lilacs. So the question is, are these things changing? And if you look at data, and people in England are particularly meticulous about counting things, and these people have been counting things for hundreds of years. And if you put all those little journals together and look at when the first lilacs bloomed, or when the first robins showed up, or when a certain crop was harvested, people are seeing some significant changes. So timing of breeding, timing of nesting, egg laying, flowering, the arrival of migrants. Hibernation patterns are even being documented. The bears in Spain did not hibernate a couple of years ago. So what happens when an animal that's supposed to hibernate doesn't hibernate? So it's a pretty significant change. If you're interested in getting all the documentation, there's a couple of references I put at the bottom. But these people have all taken large data sets from across the globe and said, if climate change was happening, what direction would we expect to see these changes? For example, timing of breeding or arrival of migrants. And over and over and over again, they're finding that the changes that they're seeing are not just random, they're going in the directions we'd expect if climate change was happening. So things are moving in that direction. In terms of kind of getting down to the visceral perspectives, just survival is an issue for things like polar bears with the ice caps changing size. And it's harder for them to get to their food. So I went to a conference in Alaska 2 falls ago, and it was interesting to hear the biologists talk about the polar bears, and the survival rates are going down significantly. But the other thing is they're basically seeing cannibalism. Polar bears eating each other because they just can't get any food. And so to hear these stories, these biologists who've been studying polar bears for 25 or 30 years say, we're seeing something we've never seen before. Okay. Well, so another example, when we think about climate change, we think about the fact that organisms could move up, or they could move closer to the poles. And so a picture over here shows, here's species A that lives at the top of the mountain, species B and species C. If things warm up, everybody just shifts up. But the question is, what's going to happen to things like pikas? The images, there's no room at the top. So the little patch blips off, and there's no A left on the right-hand side, right? So some species are not going to be doing as well. And not all systems will be able to move up in elevation or poleward. Certain things can't move because they're linked to things like the hydrology in the area. Okay, there's a new book that just came out, the Climatic Atlas of European Breeding Birds, which predicts where the birds are going to be in the future. So if you're interested in going bird watching, you might have to go to a new place. Plant biotic responses include, hardiness zones. We look at our gardening journals and we say we're in zone, 4 or 5, and this is what the kind of plant, this is the kind of raspberries we can order from the catalog. Well, people are actually thinking about redoing some of these zones because of the changes. Okay, a couple more examples, and then we'll move on to the next people here. So there's also been some expansion of diseases, and one of the examples out west is the mountain pine beetle, which normally has a 2-year life cycle and is now basically shifted to a 1-year life cycle, which has a pretty significant impact on the trees. So there's a lot of pine bark beetle death and a lot of dead trees out there. A couple of other examples is Naegleria, which is a free-living amoeba, which has been found more frequently in warm waters like in Arizona. So people go swimming and they get this stuff up their nose, and 6 people died in 2007 because of this. So there are these new diseases that are becoming more prevalent, and we'll probably hear some more from Julie about these things. Soybean rust moving north in Iowa is another example. Some of the more extreme examples of effects of climate change would be extinction. And so these are 2 examples of species that are thought to be some of the first species that went extinct because of climate change. So the golden toad and the Monteverde harlequin frog in Costa Rica both disappeared. And they think this is linked to a fungus which occurs during warmer and drier conditions. So if you think about frogs, and you think about warmer and drier conditions, if you were a frog, it would not be a good situation. Think about worms, too. You can imagine, warmer and drier is not good for things that have very permeable skin. The Aldabra banded snail is another example of a species that doesn't do as well when you have a drought. So snails would not do as well, and this is another example of a species that we think has potentially gone extinct because of climate change. So, but at the same time, I don't want to leave you with gloom and doom. So there will be some species that will do better. We can't predict all of the responses. And so here's my cartoon. It says, good news, at the current rate of global warming, we should be able to just swim over there and eat him in under 5 years. So there's going to be a mixture of responses. And some things will be better and some things will be worse. But we know that the bottom line is things will be different. And I think I'm going to cut myself off right now because we got a late start. So I'm going to let the next speaker come up. Let's see.
There's something I forgot to mention. There should be slips being passed around, donation slips. If you would, even if you're not considering a donation, would you fill that out for us so we can link you up to future events and the like? But this is a free conference, and any support that you could give us would help immensely. We've already gotten a little bit, but we gladly welcome more. Thank you.
I'm going to tell you just 2 stories about 2 organisms that are completely different in completely different places that do completely different things, about how they're going to be impacted by climate change and are being impacted by climate change just now. One of them is a federally endangered mouse, the Alabama beach mouse. There's 5 similar subspecies of beach mice that live along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. Arguably the cutest animal on the planet. I don't really think it's much of an argument, frankly, but you could try it. And here's something of their habitat. Beachfront property going for roughly $3 to $4 million for a parcel not much bigger than this room. Give you an idea of the value involved in here. And the habitat has 2 parts to it. It has a foredune area in the front part, which in this case has been swept out by a hurricane and is right now looking a little sparse. And a scrub dune in the back, which has these very old oak trees. And those may not look like old oak trees back there, but those little bushy clumps are actually little clumps of sand with little branches of oak sticking out of them, and they're very old oak trees. And that scrub dune habitat is their other favorite habitat. This animal, historically, or prehistorically, I should say, its native range is a strip of land that's about as wide as the interstate right-of-way for I-35 and about as long as from here to Des Moines. That's where they used to live. Now they live on a little piece of that. They live on actually 2 little pieces of that. A little piece that's probably 1.5 miles long, and another piece that's probably about 1.5 miles or 2 miles long, and that's it. Okay? So think of something a couple hundred meters wide and maybe 2 kilometers long in 2 pieces. Something on that order. Very tiny. Here's its native habitat in good condition, the front dunes that I was explaining to you. And sort of looming ominously in the background is perhaps the signature piece of its oncoming fate in the form of an oil well just off the coast of the Alabama beach where these guys are found. So this is their normal habitat. You go out there, you won't see any mice. If you know what to look for, you can find their tracks in the sand, but you can't actually see the mice unless you go out after dark. But what happens to them? Well, what happens to them starts out over here in Africa, actually. We have to go to Africa. And in Africa, we have a little dust storm. And a dust storm kicks up some dust and somehow starts a little foci of high-energy storm, which begins to move across the Atlantic in a process that I don't fully understand, but I know enough to understand that the climate is involved in changing the frequency and intensity of those dust storms. And they swing across the Atlantic, and as they do, they sort of follow the equator. They get hotter and hotter, and hot water is energy. It's just energy waiting to happen and turn into something. And when they get off the coast of South America, up into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, they turn into what we recognize as hurricanes. But we don't probably think of hurricanes as starting in Africa, but they do. So they swing up here, and somewhere up in here is my beach mouse, and it doesn't show up really well, but the habitat of this beach mouse, of course, is quite small. Here's the habitat of the beach mouse. It's a little blip. You can just barely see it. I think it's 5 pixels long, and it's 1 pixel wide, and probably really not a full pixel wide, but they kind of enhanced it. It fits inside the eye of Hurricane Ivan that came ashore in September of 2004. The eye of the hurricane dead centered that animal right there. You notice behind that we have the Mobile Bay, so there's no place to run to. It's all water behind you as well. And here's downtown Gulf Shores. There weren't a lot of mice in Gulf Shores to start with, but Gulf Shores is at the same elevation as their favorite habitat. And here's downtown Gulf Shores. So you could imagine that if you were living outside in the suburbs of Gulf Shores, this is what it looked like on September 16, 2004. Well, that was pretty bad news for this mouse, but a year later, on August 28th, Hurricane Katrina hit top energy levels. She was a Category 5 storm at that point. She was off the coast, but she was swinging by, just dropping by sort of for a light visit, and up there at the top you can sort of see Mobile Bay again. And it similarly pushed up this huge wall of water. And the big damage from hurricanes isn't that they have lots of wind, necessarily. It's that they push up a huge storm surge. They push tremendous amounts of water in front of them. And so 17 feet of water came up, and yet again, Gulf Shores went underwater, as did the beach mice. Well, they've been doing this for 10,000 years. And for 10,000 years, they've been living out here in this flat ground, which is their preferred habitat. It's not totally flat, it's a rolling dunes. But when a hurricane comes by, there's some anecdotal evidence that individuals actually run for the scrub in the background and survive back there, a few of them. And there's maybe perhaps a few animals that are there in advance of the storm just by chance that couldn't fit in anywhere else. But even the scrub gets hammered pretty hard, and a lot of it will die off. So there's one of those old oak trees poking out of the sand dune, and it died off from the salt spray. Alabama beach coast is the next Florida happening right now. I mean, it's really being developed at horrific rates. But some of the old neighborhoods that were built back in the 70s have a little bit of habitat between them and the surf. And they had some good grass out there. It was well protected in 1986 when this was made a federally endangered species. But there's not a lot of scrub back here. And in some of the newer developments, there's no scrub at all because the houses are on top of it. And so if this is what it looked like before and there were some mice here, there really was no place for them to run to. And this isn't the same neighborhood, but it gives you an idea of sort of what happens. It turns into a sandbox, and sandboxes aren't good even for beach mice. So pretty drastic. There's that same picture again. You get to see some of the houses in front of this duplex or condominium here. There was quite a bit of habitat. It's now gone. It's not even just sand, it's water. So it will take years for this habitat to come back. You can still buy it though. It's still for sale at the same price. And if it happens to have that ITP thing in hand, incidental take permit, it's really worth money. That means you can build there, and if there was a beach mouse, it wouldn't matter. You could squash it, and it would be fine. So this land is extremely valuable, even though you can see it's about 1 meter above water level. Okay, So it's really, really difficult to protect this habitat. There is some area behind some of these places. Often it's swampy, swales, and in some cases, as it is on the upper right, the scrub has been built upon where there's good scrub, higher elevation stuff, and they put up big condominiums, and that condominium that's just peeking out there on the right that is in pink is about 28 stories tall. So these are major complexes. They're not just little, three-house condominiums. These are major things. All of that land in front of that seawall was protected primary beachfront habitat for that mouse. It was well protected. There was a great population of beach mice back there. And the storm came, and they ran for the high ground, and they hit the wall. And there was nowhere to go. And even if they'd made it over the wall, what they would have found was this down here, which was the beach club being developed for a new tennis court and some more parking lots and so forth. So it's not even getting over the wall that's a problem. It's just there's no place to go once you get there. This habitat that used to be back there where these condominiums are, what allowed the beach mouse to persist for thousands and thousands of years, 10,000 years at least, in this habitat. Okay, but it's gone now because it's not protected under the Endangered Species Act like it should have been. So they have no place to go. Strange that we have an animal that has evolved to prefer living next to the surf, the very most vulnerable habitat it could possibly own, and yet it absolutely requires this habitat it doesn't like so much called the scrub. It doesn't like it so much that, in fact, it wasn't protected because nobody realized it was really useful to these animals. In fact, it's not just useful, it's critical. So here's some more pictures, of what it looks like. And these dunes begin to revegetate slowly. The wind begins to build the dunes back up. Sand becomes deposited. And sea oats, like this plant here, begin to poke up through there, and they give you a little bit of vegetation. Meanwhile, back here, the mice are persisting, a few handfuls of them are persisting and trying to make it through until this actually has enough groceries up front to actually support them. But this takes years. We don't know how many years. We're just trying to find out now. So part of my research is trying to figure out exactly how long it will take and what are the odds that the populations that exist on the few remaining clumps of scrub will actually be around by the time this habitat up here comes back to that nice grassy prairie-looking dunescape that we know and love as beach mouse habitat. Meanwhile, condominiums are falling down. That's all good news, you'd think, to mice, but in fact, they get built back with even bigger condominiums. So to see an old condominium collapse is actually not good because the one that comes back will look more like that one than it will look like this one, and consequences are much more severe again. There's some interesting things about the storms, and I want to just mention a few things about them. First of all, storms happen, hurricanes happen in the late summer into the fall. So somewhere about the middle of August into the 1st of October is the primary storm season. Now the actual official storm season is from June 1st to November 30th, but the really big ones and the ones we have to worry about typically come in this period. Well, beach mice go through an annual cycle. It's caused by the fact that in the wintertime things are cool, there's a lot of moisture, things can grow, and strangely enough their winters are much more pleasant than ours, and beach mouse populations actually expand, where our mice populations are declining. Come spring and into summer, things get hot and dry. Drought often happens, and the populations are really decimated. They basically don't reproduce because food quality is so poor into the summer, and then they begin to recover in the late fall, late October, November, and go back through this annual cycle. And here's when the storms hit, when the populations are at their drop-dead lowest. Okay? And the next worst thing about them is that these storms then wipe out all their habitats so that their population's ability to recover in the winter aren't there either. So they take the population at its very lowest, and they decimate it some more by making its habitat even worse. And it turns out that the absolute worst time for mouse populations following storms isn't the day after the storm, it's a year after the storm. It's the following summer after a major hurricane. So that's when we really have problems. Well, here's Ivan. Before Ivan, we had an estimated, this is just sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation of maybe 25,000 or 2,500 animals on the whole peninsula that's their native habitat. Populations were as big as they'd been seen in recent times. Post-Ivan 2005, a year after the storm, we're beginning to plummet pretty dramatically and probably had dropped to about 1% of what they used to be. So maybe from 2,500 down to 10% of what they used to be, down to about 250. And the population probably would have stayed there and maybe begun to recover because this was a full summer after that. So this was their sort of lowest low point after the storm. But that moment we got Katrina to come by, and Katrina hit us and took us down. If we lost 10% or we reduced to 10% of what we had before, now we're reduced to maybe 10% of what we had at this time. So we go from 250 maybe down to 25, a couple dozen. And at that point, we began trapping the mice, and we couldn't catch 24 mice. So we know that there were some mice, but we can't tell you that there were 25. So it's kind of a guess and probably pretty close. We probably caught almost every one of them, and we got 20. So pretty close. We're seeing the population begin to recover. We've got maybe 100, 130 mice out there right now. We're seeing a little bit of recovery, but again, we could have a storm any moment. So this gives you an idea of what these guys can do, but we're trying to model this a little bit by, this is kind of an annoying graph and I can't freeze it, by trying to figure out how fast we can expect the population to recover based on the recovery of what we call their source habitat or the foredune. So we're trying to tell the Fish and Wildlife Service, invest all your money in saving the back dune and recovering the back dune and supporting the mice until the populations can move back out into the foredunes? Or do we just forget about them, let them hang on as best they can, and really race to fix the foredunes, the dunes that they really prefer? And so we can manipulate these things, and the population growth rates in the sink, we can support them through supplemental feeding and so forth, habitat manipulations, very, very expensive. And we can sort of get some effect, an idea of what the effect is on their ability to recover. And this funny lumpy surface tells us sort of what the 50% probability is that these mice will survive this storm event. And it's all a function of how often the storm occurs. And I want to just stop this, so we'll go to another picture. Ignore it for a moment. The key thing about these storms is we don't know how they're going to change. The argument in the climate literature right now is that one group is saying, well, we're not going to have more storms, but we're going to have much more intense storms. Okay? Much more intense storms is going to make it even longer for the recovery period. And if we had that annoying graph up there, we see that by increasing the recovery time, the length of time it takes to recover from these storms, we dramatically impact their likelihood of extinction in an unfavorable fashion. We can also suggest that we might not see more intense storms, but we might simply see more of them. So if we shrink the time between them, then they never get to recover. They never get to that recovery stage, regardless of how fast we can make it happen, if those storms keep coming in time and time again. So, and of course, there's the awful possibility that we could see not only more storms, but more frequent storms and more intense storms at the same time, which would really be difficult. And we haven't even begun to address the problem of what happens if the sea level goes up, because there is no place for this beach to move back to. It's now condominiums, highways, strip malls, supermarkets, you name it. So that's in a sort of a nutshell, one story of a mouse that I don't expect will be here when I come to the end of my lifetime. That species will come to the end of its lifetime, I would guess, at about that same rate. Let me show you another one really quickly, another example real quickly, and it has really no connection to these mice other than I worked on it, and it has another very clear climate signal problem. And it's nice because it's in Iowa. There's a snail in Iowa, also federally endangered, that exists on really unique little habitats called algific slopes, and I'll get to what they are in a moment, in the very northeast corner of Iowa. And one of my grad students, Tamara Ross, now Tamara Anderson, worked on these snails for quite a while, looking at their genetics. And so we sampled a lot of these slopes, and you can see some not so clear pictures because they were scanned from slides not very well, of these very wooded northeastern Iowa slopes. They're extremely steep. They have lots of limestone in them. And they're very cold. And not just cold because this happens to be, I think, March, but cold because they have ice in them. That's what the algific property is. And they stay cold. They're naturally refrigerated. It's nature's own air conditioning. So where Tamara is on the top of that ladder, she's sticking her hand up into air that's about 50 degrees, 50 to 60 degrees. And me standing down at the bottom of that ladder taking the picture was about 85 to 90 degrees that day. It was well over 90 by the middle of the afternoon. these animals die at 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Their enzymes just go, just denature, and they're gone. So these guys are really trapped on these very special habitats. Here's a sample, or sort of the picture of the sample sites we used. We had a cluster of them up in Buck Creek because we were interested in a particular genetic hypothesis about how they would be related to each other. And then we took animals from other watersheds that uniquely flow into the Mississippi on their own watershed. So here's the Volga-Turkey River system that flows into the Mississippi here. And although this population is very close to the Maquoketa River watershed, it flows into the river down there. And there's a strange single population of these animals that live on the Illinois side. They used to be on the Iowa side, but the Mississippi River has moved on us several times and put them over on the east side. They're the only east side organism. But they're found in about 30 slopes throughout this part of the state. And we sampled these for their genetics. And what we find is that each one of these creeks is uniquely different. Their populations are tremendously different. They've been living there for about 10,000 years. 10,000 years ago, a little bit longer than that ago, we had ice over here on top of Ames. They didn't have ice over there in the northeast corner. That was the driftless zone. It was very cold, and these snails could wander around at will, and their fossils are found throughout any part of the state that wasn't glaciated. But they're not allowed to do that ever since the ice left. So we're restricted back into these unique watersheds, and each of these watersheds has become almost its own species. And in fact, one of them, down there off of the Maquoketa, is so uniquely different that we suspect it might be a completely different species than anything else on this graph, except for the outgroups that are even more different. And you can see the Illinois graph, or Illinois animals sort of keys up with Maquoketa, but not really. They're a little bit different yet. Their genetic differences are summarized in this graph, and I didn't put any p-values on there. I was a little worried about what you guys might have been thinking when Diane said p-values, and it has nothing to do with urology. This is all about probabilities. But what it really shows us is that these different populations are dramatically different. Each of these watersheds are unique in and of themselves. If we lose any one of them, we will lose a tremendous piece of information about the history of these animals. One might argue that the snails themselves aren't particularly important, but I'd argue that they are. They are a unique part of our heritage and something that is irreplaceable. Here's this population 62 I mentioned. It might be its own unique species, but basically it's part of the Turkey-Volga River populations as close as anything else, but it is really quite a bit different than the rest of them. These are just sort of showing the similarity of the haplotypes amongst the different drainages. What is an algific slope? An algific slope is this sort of created by the limestone system that we have in the northeastern part of the state. And there's somehow, we believe, cracks somewhere up high in the slope. Maybe not on top per se, but maybe on the cliff face out front. But anyway, they are contiguous with some kind of cavities system inside the slopes, which, due to cold air sinking down like on days like today, causes moisture to condense and then freeze into the form of ice. And then that air in the summertime leaks out down lower, sort of in a reverse chimney effect through this talus down below. And so you can imagine that if air is being pulled through here, cooled as it comes out, before it comes out on this talus, that we have, in fact, an air conditioning system. And you can really easily imagine what would happen if we raise the temperatures a few degrees every year. We'll see less and less ice building down here in these caverns. And that one day, on a particularly warm year, in each of these slopes, perhaps, the ice will run out before winter comes to replenish it. And when that happens, it will no longer be 55 degrees right here where the snails live in this talus going in and out between the rocks and up and down in the soil. It'll hit 75, and it'll be gone, and that'll be it. And we'll lose not only the snails up there, but probably some other species that are uniquely found on these slopes as well, including the Iowa golden saxifrage, which is so rare I can't even find a picture of it, and the northern monkshood, which has a really unique biology in and of itself, and its sister species, much like some of these others, is found thousands of miles away. In the case of monkshood, the next closest population similar to them genetically is in Alberta. Okay? Thousands of miles away. Same for the snails. I don't know about saxifrage. So these are really unique species, really unique communities that exist on these very unique environments, which are obviously very much impacted by global warming and almost certainly doomed to a very unhappy future, I'm afraid, in the face of global change. So I'll leave that at that point for the next person, which is Fred. Are you next? Okay. You need to get to Acrobat. Okay. You got used to
I'm the technical difficulty.
So are you...
Well, we'll find out here. Can you view it in any sort of full screen mode? That's what I was looking for. All right. We'll see how this works. So I took a little bit of a different approach to this morning, trying to tell a story less with the science in the sense of graphs and the like, and a bit more in words and pictures. But the only reason I think anything I say might be very useful or effective, the story that I tell, will be because Diane and Brent set the stage, and I don't have to explain the science of climate change quite so much. So what I'm going to do is focus a bit on turtles. So my lab does a lot of research, as you were told, on reptiles. But I'm going to talk specifically about our work on turtles for several reasons. I think they exemplify the kinds of issues that we will be seeing with climate change. But here I'm going to tell a story about sort of local population as an example of what might be happening on a more global scale. So turtles have been around for 250-some million years. They've survived a lot of things, but it's not clear how they're going to survive what we're up against now. The other nice thing about turtles is that they are infused throughout our popular culture in a variety of different ways, from Grateful Dead albums to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and advertisements and stories of all different sorts. They're also in a variety of religious or mythological stories. That didn't turn out very well for some reason, but here we have the voice of the turtle is heard in the valley and the Song of Solomon in the Bible and various other sorts of religions. So they're popular. They hold play an important role from not just practically, but in these sorts of senses as well. And cut off, interesting. And what's a bit surprising is that the importance of diversity independently of human cultures places on turtles is nonetheless counterbalanced by this observation, which is that other than freshwater mollusks, and even more so than the well-known declining amphibians, Diane mentioned briefly, that turtles actually comprise the most endangered major group of animals on Earth. Roughly 70% of the known species of turtles on Earth are listed by the IUCN, which is international. It's essentially a listing of species that are in trouble. Well, where does my lab's research come in on this? Well, I'm going to tell you one aspect that we study that has to do with the issue of climate change as well as with conservation. So one of the neat things about turtles that they've got, for the most part anyway, is they have a very unusual way in which they determine the sex of the individuals. And it's a kind of sex called environmental sex determination. And under environmental sex determination, what happens is that the sex of the individual is determined by some kind of an environmental cue during a discrete period early in their life. So this cue could be photoperiod, it could be pH, it could be nutrition, it could be temperature, some kind of a cue. And when that cue is one way or the other, the individual becomes permanently a male or a female. So it's pretty neat. And we can contrast this kind of environmental sex determination with the kind that you're probably more familiar with called genotypic sex determination, and that's essentially where the sex of the individual is determined right at conception by genetic factors. So in humans, we have our sex chromosomes. Right? So that's the contrast. So these types of GSD mechanisms are much more common than the environmental ones, but as you might gather, the environmental ones are more sensitive to environmental variation. The kind of environmental sex determination that occurs in turtles, and in fact in many different reptile groups, is temperature-dependent sex determination, or TSD. And this is an illustration of one kind of TSD. And what I've got plotted in the schematic is the percentage of male individuals produced under certain conditions as a function of some kind of constant temperature. And if you follow the black line, you can see that very cool temperatures produce 100% males, very warm temperatures here produce 100% females, and there's this narrow, roughly 2 to 3 degrees here, bounded by the vertical yellow dashed lines, where you can get some males and some females produced. So it's a very narrow range. It's a very rapid switch point. Well, my lab does a bunch of things that try to address aspects of TSD in turtles. I'm only going to focus on the last one here today, but we do ask the question of how does it work in nature? Why would an organism leave such a fundamentally important trait totally up to the vagaries of the environment? But this is the one I'm going to focus on telling you a little bit about today. And that is, what are the ramifications of having TSD given rapid climate change and human modification of habitats, especially when so many of these species that have TSD are already imperiled? We're adding one more insult. There are at least, well, as far as we know, there are 4 ways in which these organisms could respond to a changing climate. And, excuse me, I've listed these here. One of them is they could just evolve a different sex-determining mechanism. It's a little easier said than done. They can't just sort of snap their claws and say, we need sex chromosomes. It doesn't really work that way. So it's not really clear that that's going to happen. And turtles being long-lived with long generation times, it's not the sort of thing that's going to happen on a fast scale. The other thing is Diane hinted at, they could conceivably change their geographic range. They could move farther north, say, or farther south if they were in the southern hemisphere. But this is less likely, certainly in the northern hemisphere, as we've bisected our habitat with interstates and suburban housing developments and the like. It's not really an option. And turtles move at a turtle's pace anyway. It works on geological time scales, but not over the time scale which current climate change is happening. So what we've identified, without getting into great detail, is roughly, if you're not going to go extinct, you've got pretty much now 2 viable options left if you're an animal with TSD, and that's change that set point in the middle of that sex-determining graph, or change something with respect to your nesting behavior. And those are the 2 that my lab is really focused on. And what I'm going to do is focus today mostly on the latter one, which is the nesting behavior aspect. So for the last 20 years, my lab has studied these guys, among other species of turtle. These are painted turtles. And they live in a population that we've emphasized studying on the Mississippi River. This is the schematic. It's the population's, maybe about 10 miles north of Clinton. It's on the Illinois side. It's very close to Brent's Illinois population of Iowa Pleistocene snails. But it's an island that's in the Mississippi River, and we call it Turtle Camp, affectionately called Turtle Camp. And the great thing about the Mississippi River is there's a lot of great literature about the Mississippi River. It's romanticized in lots of ways, and this picture maybe adds to that romanticism. It's beautiful, and the sun just coming up, steam over the water, placid river. Lots of little black things flying around. Yeah, that's the bad part. Anyways, we spend roughly from mid-May, till early July every year during the nesting season of these animals to get a handle on exactly what they're doing in any given year. So we watch them nest. And when I talk about this, I really do mean we, because it takes a lot of people to follow lots of turtles nesting at these sites. And these are just some of the students with their incredible coordination. But we camp in tents on this island to do the research. And this is what we're looking for. So the turtles live in the water. When the environmental cues are just right, they emerge from the river and crawl out onto the land, and they dig these little subterranean nests. The nests are about 5 to 10 centimeters deep, and roughly 2 to 4 inches deep, and they deposit their little eggs, they cover them up, and then they leave, never to come back again. So the eggs there's no sort of parental care. And there are anywhere from 200 to 300 of these laid every year at the field site. So the females come out in nests anywhere between mid-May and the end of June, early July. The eggs in these nests incubate during the course of the summer, and then we return in mid to late September, and we excavate these nests and retrieve the babies, just like these right here, and bring them back to the lab and figure out which ones are males and which ones are females. Well, this slide encapsulates the first 19 years of data on this particular population. I'm going to walk you through it so you can get a sense of what message I'm trying to convey here. Again, we've got the percent male plotted on that y-axis. So as a function now of the mean July temperature. July turns out to be important based on laboratory studies. That's roughly the period of embryonic development when the sex of the babies is sensitive to temperature. And in that original plot I showed you of sex determination, it turns out that this plot in nature roughly matches that. Where again we've got in years like 1992, every single baby painted turtle produced on the island was a male. And that can be contrasted with years like 1988, when it was a very hot summer, and every single baby painted turtle produced was a female, and years in between. But it's that same sigmoidal sort of shape. So what do we learn from this? We learned that, just like in the lab under constant temperatures, their sex is sensitive to temperature, same kind of a pattern. What else do we learn? We learned that there's some scatter around there, yes, but we also learned that here's the 75-year, 65-year mean July temperature for the site. And if we take this and project up to the line and over, it says that roughly, on average, over the long term, we get some males and some females. About a 1-to-1 ratio. So that's an interesting result. I think even more interesting, the final thing I'd like you to get from this is that if the mean changes roughly 1.5 degrees, which is that's at the low end of the climate change predictions, you get to 100% females in an average year.